In this module, we study the portion of Beethoven's life corresponding to what you have lived thus far. That is, if you're a college student of traditional age. Take a moment to think about how your family and the places you've lived have shaped your personality, your experiences, and your knowledge of the world. In Module 1, we learned some general information about Central Europe in the 18th century. Now, we will focus more specifically on details of Beethoven's childhood and early musical training in the electorate of Cologne during the 1770s and 1780s. Keep in mind that in an era before instantaneous global communications, geography was a hugely important factor in determining what people could know at first hand, and how quickly and how much they could find out about anything happening elsewhere. Take the example of Mozart. You may already know that he started his career as a child prodigy, trained from an early age by his musician father. That explains how Mozart could write so much music despite his untimely death at age 35, because he started his professional career so early in his life. But it doesn't tell us anything about his musical personality. If you compare his music to that of his contemporaries, there is no sonic fingerprint that indicates to listeners, oh, this must be the work of a former child prodigy. To understand why Mozart's music sounds the way it does, it's more important to know that of all the German-speaking lands in the mid-18th century, his hometown of Salzburg, in modern-day Austria, was unusual as a hotbed of Italian opera. Recognizing Mozart's early and extensive exposure to that particular style of music not only explains how, as an adult, he could write several masterworks of Italian opera, it also points to what makes his music in other genres distinctive. Even in Mozart's music without singers, such as his symphonies and his piano sonatas, there are clear traces of Italian operatic style. Instrumental music that sounds as though it were transcribed from an opera. So, in this module, we will learn about some of the formative aspects of Beethoven's youth in Bonn, in both his home life and the local musical culture. To better understand Beethoven's innovations in music, we are going to dig a little deeper into some of the ideas introduced in Module 1. First, we will take in a more extensive introduction to classical style, examining the contrast between Baroque and classical styles in more detail. Then, we will listen more closely to three genres that are particularly important in Beethoven's music: sonata, fantasia, and fugue. The sonata allegro template is central because it's not limited to piano sonatas. The form also shows up in Beethoven's symphonies, concert overtures, string quartets, and music of other genres. So we will closely examine one sonata allegro movement by Mozart to learn about that template in more detail. The fantasia is a genre that strives to sound like a spontaneous improvisation, even though the music is entirely, or almost entirely, composed beforehand and specified through explicit notation. We will listen to an example by Haydn, whom we will encounter again in Module 3, after Beethoven moves to Vienna. In future modules, we will study a half dozen of Beethoven's landmark piano sonatas, including one he explicitly labeled as a sonata quasi una fantasia, that is, a hybrid of the two genres. You might be surprised that we're spending any time on fugue, given that it's so closely identified with Baroque music. Wasn't it hopelessly outdated and out of fashion by the time Beethoven began his career? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, the genre features imitative counterpoint, which doesn't fit the classical emphasis on simplicity. So, during Beethoven's youth, fugue was indeed out of style. But that made it rare, and as economics and information theory tell us, rare things are valuable. In this case, it's not a question of monetary value, but rather artistic value. That is, in a predominantly homophonic musical landscape, counterpoint offered a dramatic contrast of texture, and thus a powerful expressive resource. Ergo, we will examine another fugue from Book 1 of J.S. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier collection, more closely than we did in Module 1. Prelude and Fugue No. 5 present a strikingly different character. They thus illustrate the variety of Bach's output, and should help you develop a stronger sense of what Beethoven learned from Christian Gottlob Neefe in Bonn.